it's complicated because there's a lot of politics and policies and values that are all intermixed. As individual lawmakers, there's a lot of ethical conflation going on. There's like a bunch of bills that come out. That's the entire budget. Out of those 8 or 9 bills, you have literally like 2 hours max. It's impossible to read it. You can't read like 5,000 pages in 2 hours. You do your best leading up to it, trying to understand what's going to be in it. And after it's printed, you make sure that the stuff that you really disagree with, you identify where they put it in, and then you have to make a choice. Like, will you vote no while there's this one toxic, poisonous thing, but that's also tied to all these other funding things that you will support? And every lawmaker has to make that choice. They purposely designed it this way, and that's why they put what we call poison bills into these bills, knowing that it's going to pass. And the whole kind of scam with lobbyists and special interest groups and billionaires and big corporations, the whole game is to get the most toxic, exploitative thing tied to the state budget, so it's going to get done for your client. And the criminal justice stuff was heart-wrenching because a lot of it is politicized and people want to go back, get reelected, and tell their voters, I did something to punish those violent people. I'm tough on crime. Is the perpetual cry that politicians stick to get reelected and to appease the anger and the fear of the electorate. But what we are doing, rolling back in all these criminal justice reforms, whether it's like raising the age or the bail reform, or making sure when we have discovery that people who are being accused have access to evidence, which oftentimes they don't. Knowing that when we do this, like 98% of the people who are just stuck in the system were found to be innocent. 98% are not repeat offenders, right? We're giving these people a real chance, especially young kids, to go back, go to school, get a job, whatever. They're not repeat offenders. It's like the small percentage out of the 2%, maybe like the 0.1% become violent offenders. But in order to catch that 0.001%, we passed this massive catch-all kind of last-minute thing that will inevitably result in multiple generations in the next 10 years of Black and brown kids just being swept away because they're poor. They're doing petty things like stealing cigarettes or liquor at the corner store, or jumping a turnstile in the subway. And now, if you do that, the law that we just passed, which I voted against, will allow cops to arrest them and send them to Rikers, and without bail.
What is the alternative to capturing the 0.01 or 0.1% that are violent offenders? How do you do that without that kind of a sweeping policy change?
So there was many things that we did, and I was willing to compromise on the mental health changes. I think that's something that we would have received more consensus. And if you're really hyper focused on expanding what they call the Kanjar's law to identify, monitor, and intervene to get people to sometimes involuntarily be treated when multiple sources of doctors and psychologists and counselors deem, through a 3 or 4 people, professionals deem that this person is a danger to himself or to herself and must be treated at a proper facility, we should be able to do that. We did this to an extent. That's something that I would have been exclusively focusing on to get right. We didn't even have time. We did something kind of a Band-Aid in mental health. But I think if we just focus on mental health, because we know the repeat offenders, the people who are doing repeat petty crimes, and help monitor those things better with better resources and funding to intervene at early stages. With the combination of those things, I think we could have done this better and identified people who are most likely going to turn out to be violent offenders, who are most likely mentally triggered. But what we did here is allow the courts to define for themselves who they deem as dangerous. We didn't use the word dangerous, but what we used was worked around it and give a lot of flexibility. So that a judge can look at someone and say, this person is going to cause harm. We don't define what harm is or serious harm in the language of the law. But what was happening is all these kids who don't have money get arrested for petty crime, and without being proven of guilt, they get stuck in Rikers for 1, 2, 3, sometimes 3 years before they go to court, and they just get murdered. We lost 12 kids in Rikers Island in a year before even they went to court. By the law, these are still innocent people that couldn't make bail because they couldn't pay $100 in bail and were stuck in Rikers for over a year.
What do you attribute the uptick in violence to? Do you think that it's a combination of bail reform with COVID, with a lack of programs supporting people who are suffering?
We lost the narrative around bail. All the major people who do this for a living have shown that the bail reform has nothing to do with the uptick in crime, but that's what every corporate media has pushed. There's a whole group of, bounty hunter type businesses that make hundreds of millions of dollars off the bail business. And our reform completely eliminated this market. They've been driving this narrative since the reform that core crime is going up because of bail reform. The bail was never intended as a tool to punish people. It's just a way to get people to come back to court. And people somehow this narrative stuck. The new polls show that the majority of voters, as a solution, want more housing and a fix to homelessness. They attribute lack of housing and homelessness as to the uptick of crime, not bail. Unfortunately, the knee-jerk reaction in Albany has rolled back everything that we did around criminal justice, and it's going to result. 10 years later, we're going to look at this moment and describe it as another chapter of racist policies that we submitted to in the moment of fear. There could have been many different ways where we could have identified, monitored, and kept our communities safe without a blanket sweep. Going into summer, national trend, we're going to see an increase in crime no matter what. Summers bring higher crime rates. It's not just New York. The entire country will see a higher crime rate. So whatever we did now, the message we give to underserved communities that may be causing the crimes, there's no correlation. And so that we're going to continue to see a rise in crime going into the summer. The majority of people internally who came out and said we could do this were citing personal political reasons to do this, not because there were good policies.
What impact do you think this is going to have on anti-Asian and anti-Semitic violence?
If we individualize what's happening, some 15, 16-year-old kid that may get swept away as a result of bad policies comes back out 3 or 4 years later. And that kid is not going to be sympathetic to the Asian community. I think we're just punting and recycling the hatred between communities. So next time we have an economic or social meltdown, we're going to see another wave of anti-Asian sentiments. I'm just laying out the picture. Like, I don't have a solution. I'm just recognizing the pattern of what's happening between Asian and Black and brown communities. We're being pitted against each other. It's impossibly hard to do the right thing where we find the right balance while making Asian victims feel safe. I had a long dinner before I went up to Albany with the family of Michelle Go. I sat next to the dad for like 2 hours. He was very focused on recognizing that we fail is the attacker as much as we fail the daughter. The city and the state, wherever the victim came from, unless we understand that we also fail to interject, educate, or improve the conditions where those violent behaviors came from, we're not actually fixing the problem. It's easy to come out and say we caught this guy and let's just fry him. He was getting baited all the time with national media to come out and say stuff like that, and he just refused to do it. That conversation actually validated all the data that we read before, that 70% of victims actually are not as punitive and vindictive as we outside observers think they are. The main concern is for others not to go through similar type of pains and traumas. But unfortunately, that's kind of where we landed now. The political fear that dictates electoral politics needs politicians to come out and say, we're going to lock these people away.
Why is it so hard to get housing made for the homeless?
That's a great question. And why is it so easy to give $1.1 billion to billionaires? That's the ultimate question. We fought tooth and nail before we had this wave to put in record number $3 or $6 billion towards building supportive. This was like 5 years ago, in supportive housing. We saw the uptick in trends, and as many of us predicted, if you don't get ahead of this now, it's going to get ugly 5 years later, and it did. But if we had supportive social housing and stock of places to put people in, we would have been a much better place. Housing is the number one driver that triggers people. If you don't have shelter and you can't protect your own kids, there's a point when humans become, what you politicians are telling me is that I'm better off killing someone where I could have shelter, and not feel cold, and I could get a shower and 3 meals. And the irony is the amount of money we're spending to build new prisons, we spend a fraction of that. We can build housing and give people actual basic income, and we can still save money. We're fueling the violence by these policies. There's no way people can't be violent when you're giving $1 billion to billionaires, but leaving nothing for the people on the bottom, and actually passing policies to lock them up. I met some of them was brilliant teenage kids. They're literally saying these billionaires get all the money they want. I want to get my own. Why am I going to follow the rules when these guys are stealing our money and they're celebrated?
So what you're saying is that a lack of affordable housing is one component, a lack of support for people who need mental health treatment is another component, and both of these things related to living through the pandemic and people suffering through that. Do you think it's media portrayal? Do you think that the city
Yeah.
is not more dangerous as it's being painted?
I think the media has a role in not telling the real causes of the violence. Bail reform didn't cause the violence. People's poverty is causing the violence. What we're doing with bail is punishing low offenders who are committing crimes of poverty and punishing them for being poor because you can't afford bail. A trust fund kid can steal whatever he wants and could make bail. His parents can pay for a $1 million bond. Whereas a local kid who's stealing a loaf of bread and gets caught because he's hungry and trying to feed his kids, can't make $100 bail. It is a system that punishes people who are poor, who are more likely to commit petty crime. So instead of addressing the root causes of the poverty that's driving those petty offenses, we're just punishing them from being poor. It's very hard to actually go toward policies that liberate Black and Brown communities. We go from movements, different types of movements, to establishment power, more likely to establish, whether it's a nonprofit industry or any, policy, government lobbying. Everyone falls under establishment while making a livelihood out of movements, but a very few will stick to their original mission and fight for things that get Black and Brown communities toward liberation.
I have two questions. In everything that you've said, why do you think what happened to Una Lee happened? Why do you think what happened to the Filipina and Yonkers, why did that happen? And what happened in Albany, does that address that level of crime?
I do not know how what we did will alleviate a middle-aged Black man from punching a vulnerable Filipino woman 128 times while she's on the floor. Because the data shows there's no correlation. That particular man, Yonkers, won't even go to Rikers, right? They're New Rikers in New York City. Will that person think twice now that we roll back bail? That's what I think people will try to sell to the public.
This, like the rollback and the crime policy now, does that have an immediate impact on how police behave?
I think what people are saying is culturally that some cops felt like lawmakers did not have their back. That's something that we hear. Doing these rollbacks, are we now giving a cultural nod to the police? I mean, that's what some people are saying culturally, like we need a cultural shift.
It seems like in trying to create policy that liberates poor Black and Brown communities, that there has to be supporting programs when you go for that kind of reform.
I think we reformed without implementing and seeing the outcome of whatever investments we made in the communities. Like we literally repealed everything in 2 years. 2 years is not enough time to see generational change. And at the moment, it seemed like people are so busy with narratives and talking about hate crimes and spinning it to kind of meet the moment of the fear. But when you see the data that would inevitably come out in 5, 10 years from now, we're going to be looking back and be ashamed that we did this again, like the second, third, fourth time, instead of like you're saying, doing the hard work and recognizing all these 14, 15, 16-year-old kids fell into the category of being pro-crime, but we lifted the ability to trial them as adults and just lock them away in Rikers Island. So now they're free on the streets, but do they have a summer job? Do they have like, is there an after-school mentor? We should have planned it even before we reformed to make sure the programs came first before we release them. I'm in a weird place because the legislation that included the criminal justice rollbacks were in the same bill as the Buffalo Bill Stadium. Originally, the Buffalo Stadium bill was in a different bill, or the Capitol bill, which where it belongs. But they didn't have enough votes. People were going to vote down on the Capitol bill. So they took that component out and snuck it into the education bill along with criminal justice rollbacks, making it impossible for people to vote against it. We're talking about, $100 million of school aid for your district tied to all this stuff. Almost 50 people voted against it. There was like 20 Democrats who were voted against it, not just me. As a voter and someone who's doing all these programs, how does this action, before speaking to me, like how did you perceive the action versus now after speaking with me?
The forums that we did, a lot of things came out. All but one of the forums, people were crying through the whole program and struggling to like share how they feel. And, it ranged from people sharing that they were assaulted and it was the first time they were admitting it, to people talking about their work environment and how, they feel disempowered and unseen, and everybody has these like DEI movements, but it's lip service. It's not actually like caring about changing things. And I think not caring about actually seeing people. It's about checking a box. One of the hosts was my friend who works for Defenders. We had to scramble to fill in for a host who was in Albany. I said to her, "What's going on?" And she said, "It's just a mess up there. And they're about to like repeal this bail reform and it's devastating." I said, "Well, what's the problem? Like, I'm sitting here like listening to people who are afraid to walk out their front door. What's wrong with that?" She was very patient with me and explained that it's not solving the problem, it's not making us safer, and it in fact is putting other communities in peril, and that, these policies will ultimately be weaponized against our communities, our immigrant communities, and that people will die in Rikers who are innocent. It's hard. It's hard to try to like get the community to talk, and it's hard not having any answers. We have to be talking to each other, and we have to be talking to other communities. Like the only thing I can identify is that we have to like stand together and support each other's safety.
Yeah.
But it's not easy to talk to other communities, especially when you're coming from a place of, trouble of being in fear.
Yeah, no, it's weird because in the moment where I see the woman getting beat up on social media, like getting punched nonstop, in that moment, I'm like, I don't care. And then I calm down and really look at what we're doing. But that is the ethical moral question. How many people, innocent people, are we willing to lock up to prevent that one incident from happening? Is it 10 people that kind of look like him or fall into the same category of background that could potentially one day be violent? Or is it 20? Is it 100? What is worth sacrificing to prevent that one crime? And I took a different approach early on because I couldn't answer that question. In the interim, let's help empower our Asian community with the tools. If you want to give every single person a pepper spray, or you know, ability to have a companion walk them to everywhere, like all the stuff that could at least help us defend ourselves, do that for us. So that's kind of where I landed, and yeah, I didn't have enough time. Within a matter of weeks, we swept everything back. And coming out of it, like even though we may feel a little bit safer individually, because now you know that anyone that looks like a violent person under the system will be swept for doing anything stupid, and maybe they themselves will feel a little bit more scared next time they think about doing something stupid. But how does the intercommunity dynamic come out of this? 2, 3 months next year, 2 years from now, like how will the Black community perceive Asian communities? I don't know how this is going to play out in terms of intercommunity dialogue or conflict moving forward.
What I take away is that it's very difficult for an individual person to make things change despite our individual desires to do right by each other. It feels like just waves of other people's interests that win out in the end.
I agree. I mean, I think we have a lot of idealistic goals that shape our sense of what's right for solidarity and getting along. At the end of the day, the system enforces tribalistic racial order. That's how the system is designed. If there is a clash of things that's happening in this community, then the other community will respond and ultimately have some sort of order, reinforce some sort of order that way. Yeah.
Like during the 80s or 90s, when there was like so much violence against the LGBTQ community, do you know how that changed? Because it feels like the LGBTQ community
Yeah.
took control of their destiny. They are, a magnet for violence now in terms of policy and everything, but in terms of like on a day-to-day safety
Yeah.
level.
Basically, they became rainbow capitalists. They went inside of capitalism and created a niche space of money and power and became an established force to be reckoned with. They reached a status that we just know, all right, you don't mess with this, and you do something wrong in this space, you're just going to be crushed, socially, politically, culturally. That's why many on the left refer to that as rainbow capitalist. Like, you guys are still capitalist, but you just put a rainbow decoration around it. Now the Asian communities will, I think, create that space of power and trying to replicate the LGBTQ Jewish model.